Right. Well, we've made it to we've made it to the end. I mean, we're still here. We still have a final talk left. And I'm really excited for our next speaker. Amesh Adalja is a senior scholar at Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security. He is focused on emerging infectious diseases, pandemic preparedness, and biosecurity. He served on U.S. government panels and tasked with developing guidelines for treatment for things like the plague, botulism, anthrax, and in mass casualty settings. And I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Amesh Adalja, our last and final speaker for the day. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for having me. So everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I just want to share. I did actually have some slides. I'm just going to try and figure out how to do this to share my screen. Let me see how I can figure this out. So
there's a share screen button at the bottom of your screen.
All right, let me just do that for you.
Yeah.
That was probably not going to work.
You don't see the share screen button?
Yeah, I do. It's just sorry. Let me. It's probably not going to work because I have to quit to do it.
Okay.
Okay. So what I wanted to talk about today, and I'll do this without slides then, is to talk about what about this pandemic was predictable, what was knowable, and how do you think about pandemic pathogens and what makes a pathogen able to cause a pandemic? And that's something that many people think of as a mystery, but it's really not a mystery if you actually think about what it is that causes pandemics. So when you think about a pandemic pathogen, there's a certain alchemy that it has to have. Certain characteristics have to be there. And I did a project a couple of years ago trying to understand what would be the pathogen most likely to be able to cause a pandemic. And when you look at that, there are certain types of characteristics. And one of them that I think is really important is, it's pretty obvious, but it's efficient transmissibility from human to human. And this is a reason why, for example, if you look at an Ebola outbreak, that's never going to be a pandemic because it doesn't efficiently transmit from human to human. And though Ebola might have a very high fatality rate, 60 to 90% in some cases, you don't have to have that high of a fatality rate to cause a pandemic. The word pandemic doesn't mean something is very severe or kills a lot of people. It doesn't even have to have a high case fatality rate. If you look, for example, at 1918 influenza, probably about 1% to 2%. So you don't have to look at a 60% case fatality rate and say that's going to be a very bad pandemic. So it just has to have some fatality rate, and be efficiently transmitted from human to human. One of the other factors about a pandemic pathogen is contagiousness during the incubation period. And this has been something a bit of a controversy with this coronavirus, trying to understand when people become infectious. But we know, for example, with influenza, and why influenza is such a good pandemic pathogen, is that it's contagious during its incubation period, meaning before you have any symptoms, you can give somebody influenza. And that seems to be the case, at least in certain circumstances, with this virus. And we've seen it, for example, in people who are singing. We've seen it in household contacts. And this is something that really makes it impossible to contain, because when you have something that is transmissible during the incubation period, you don't know who's sick and who isn't, and you cannot contain it by definition. And the same is true for mild illnesses during contagiousness. So if you are somebody who has mild symptoms, you can go about your activities of daily living. That's going to expose more people than if you are somebody that's much more sick and, for example, in the hospital. Other types of issues are that, pandemic pathogens don't have vaccines. They don't have antivirals for them. You have also an immunologically naive population. So that means people in the community do not have any immunity to it. And that's kind of what the basic types of stuff you have to have. So efficient transmission between humans. Doesn't really matter so much about the fatality rate. Contagiousness or mild illness occurring during the incubation period or shortly after the incubation period in a population that hasn't seen this before. So when you look at that, contagiousness from human to human, there are many different ways that pathogens can get from person to person. It could be, for example, that it goes from fecal oral, like hepatitis A or polio, or it could use a mosquito. But one of the factors is respiratory and droplet transmission. That means airborne transmission or respiratory droplets. Either of those is a very efficient way for something to get from a person to person. And it's a simple thing because you cannot stop people from breathing or coughing or sneezing the same way that you can clean up sanitation, for example, and stop a fecal oral outbreak from happening. So we see these hepatitis A outbreaks that have occurred all over the United States in places like San Diego, for example. And really the solution to that is sanitation. It's not so simple with the respiratory virus. You really have to arrest any kind of respiratory pathogen, whether it's a virus or whatever it is, because you have to intervene to stop people basically from talking and breathing, coughing, sneezing. All of that is much, much harder. So respiratory droplet transmission is very important when it comes to this. If you think about a mosquito borne, we see many diseases that have a wide swath where mosquitoes transmit them. For example, malaria or yellow fever or dengue or chikungunya or Zika. But you're still limited by the fact that the mosquito has a certain range that it can go into, and it's not going to be worldwide in the same manner that a respiratory droplet spread infection is. And then the next step is, we talk about pathogens, and there's so many different types of pathogens. There's viruses, there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's protozoa. And when you have to try and think about which are most likely to cause a pandemic, there's some important considerations. So bacteria, in the past, people talk about the Black Plague or the Black Death. That was caused by a bacteria. But the fact is, it's very, very hard for a bacteria now to cause a major pandemic. Why? Because we've got antibiotics. Broad spectrum antibiotics basically took bacteria off the pandemic list. Even when we have drug resistant bacteria, we can usually still craft something together that can work against bacteria. So let's go to fungi. Sometimes you hear about fungus infections decimating populations. So for example, salamanders or bats or other reptile species. And there's even hypotheses that dinosaurs were part of their extinction might have been because of fungi. But interesting thing about fungi is that they don't like to be in things that are 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It's actually a hypothesis that mammals evolved that temperature as a way of evading fungi. And when you look at reptiles, for example, they're cold-blooded and they have a lower temperature. And so fungi don't really do so well in mammals. And when they do, for example, like in bats, when they cause white nose syndrome, those bats, their temperature drops when they're hibernating. And that's where you see white nose syndrome. So it's very hard for fungi to be able to cause that type of an event, a pandemic in a human species. It's much different in reptiles, for example. When you look at, obviously, when you think about hookworm or tapeworm or those types of pathogens, they really don't have the capacity to cause a pandemic. It's really viruses that you're left with. And it's because viruses are mutable. They're just basically pieces of genetic material encased in a protein coat. And they're very elegant, they're very small, and they have this rapidity of transmission and replication. They can get to very high levels pretty quickly in a body. If you look at how many virions per milliliter there are in, for example, someone with hepatitis C, it can be in the billions. It's very, very high. So this is something that allows viruses to experiment genetically, meaning that they have selection pressures, they can mutate much faster. And we don't have anything close to a broad spectrum antiviral. Although today you've been hearing a lot of news, if you've been watching it, about remdesivir, which is sort of like a broad spectrum antiviral. We don't have a proper broad spectrum antiviral the way we can just pull an antibiotic off the shelf and be pretty confident that it's going to work or not work based on what we know about it. The last thing I wanted to tell you about is one pathogen group that people ask me about are prions. And people might not spend much time thinking about prions, but prions are just plain proteins that are infectious. And they're well known because of the events that happened in England around the year 2000 with mad cow disease, or before 2000, around in the late 1990s. And prions, again, are something that are not able to really cause a pandemic unless you have, for example, widespread cannibalism going on, where in places in Papua New Guinea, for example, they did have widespread infections in certain tribes, but that was because cannibalism was going on. And I think we'd have to be a whole new different state of society for cannibalism to be the norm, and a lot of other things would have gone wrong if a prion was going to be a pandemic threat. And just a couple of other things to think about. So has there ever been a mammal that's been rendered extinct by an infectious disease? The answer is yes. And it was an interesting thing. It was the Christmas Island rat. And it was actually a protozoa that drove it extinct. It was spread by mosquitoes. And it's really because that rat, the Christmas Island rat, had nowhere to go except Christmas Island. It could not get away from the mosquito as well as the protozoa. But that's the only well-documented extinction event that we have from an infectious disease in a mammalian species. So when you talk about viruses, so we're going to settle on viruses. And one of the things about viruses is that they're not just simple. There's great diversity there. And one of the biggest diversities is what their genetic material is made of. Are they RNA or are they DNA, for example? And that might sound like some esoteric type of difference, but the fact is RNA viruses mutate at a much higher rate than DNA viruses. RNA is a much less stable compound. So when you think about pandemic threats, in the virus realm, RNA viruses usually rise to the top. And anything that you've heard about that's been scary or in the headlines is usually an RNA virus. There are some exceptions. For example, smallpox is the DNA virus, but RNA virus in general is something that we look at because of its mutability, and many of the most dangerous families of viruses are RNA viruses. And the most famous of those RNA viruses is influenza. And there's been a lot of talk about influenza during this pandemic and comparing it to coronaviruses. They are a different and distinct family of viruses, but what makes influenza such a formidable challenge is the fact that its genetic material, the RNA that makes that make up its genes, are on different segments, almost like a deck of cards. So influenza can constantly shuffle that deck of cards. So suppose, for example, a pig gets infected with 2 different strains of influenza. Those strains can then shuffle their card decks and you get something new coming out. So pigs can act as what we call as mixing vessels. And that's what makes influenza so difficult to predict and why it's always a pandemic threat, because there are lots of combinations of flu viruses in pigs, in birds, and they can always shuffle and recombine and come out with something new. And indeed, every one of our pandemics, 1918, 1957, 1968, 2009, were the result of those types of events. And that's why flu will always be a major threat. And even despite this whole shuffling of the card decks, flu itself mutates its major proteins in a way that many viruses don't do. For example, the coronavirus mutates actually very low compared to flu. And that's why with flu, we have to change our vaccine basically every year as the virus kind of drifts genetically. And that's something we probably may not have to do with any kind of coronavirus vaccine that is developed, because coronaviruses don't mutate so much. And there are animal coronavirus vaccines, for example, that we use in cows and avian species that don't have that problem of having to change it every year. But flu is always going to be on the top because of what it does. And if you look at flu, for example, if you ask me to say what are the scariest flu viruses, there is one called H7N9, which is an avian flu species that has a case fatality rate of about 60%. So we're talking about, with this coronavirus, a case fatality rate of less than 1%, maybe 0.5%. A 60% case fatality rate avian flu, if that developed human-to-human transmissibility, would be very disastrous, a very different pandemic than what we're dealing with now. And that's what most of our pandemic plans are premised on, is an avian flu virus with that high of a case fatality rate. And there we would use very blunt tools like this social distancing, because it would be such a major threat. And that's one to keep an eye on, because it is something that is in China, but really has no ability yet to have sustained human-to-human spread. You see humans getting infected based on their exposure to poultry, for example, and maybe some limited spread within a household or a family, but not human-to-human spread. And that's one of the bigger fears I have, is one of those avian influenza viruses developing pandemic potential. One of the last things I want to touch on before I can take some questions are human factors. Human factors are a major factor in how pandemics spread. Not because it's not just the virus and not just the immune system of the host. It's what decisions we make. So if you look back in 2003 with the advent of the SARS coronavirus, that was the first time coronavirus has really hit the map as a pandemic pathogen. Most of that problem, the 8,000 cases that we saw around the world, the billions of dollars of global loss, was because of human factors, meaning that at that time, China suppressed data about that happening. It was basically leaked to the general public, leaked to the medical community through email boards, something very similar to what you've seen happen with this virus. And the fact that this was covered up for so long put the United States and other countries basically behind the 8 ball trying to respond to it. And that's why SARS became such a disruptive event, because it wasn't something that was very, very contagious among humans. It's just that we let it fester because we didn't have good data. So anytime you have a pandemic, whether it's from anytime you have any infectious disease outbreak, the human factors and how humans respond to this play a major role. So if you look even at this outbreak, this SARS coronavirus, there are clearly missteps in China, for example, in terms of when they discovered that there was sustained human-to-human spread, how well they notified the World Health Organization about that, what types of people they allowed in to help them do that. And then on the other side, It's the United States response, where we knew this was a community spreading respiratory virus that had a range of symptoms from very mild to very severe. Knowing that this is going to spread, knowing that it had been in China at least since mid-November, tells you that this virus was going to be everywhere by the time we actually took notice of it. So this wasn't going to be just a travel-related infection. Indeed, we've found that this likely arrived in the United States in late December or early January. And at that time, as soon as we knew that this was something spreading in the community in China, we needed to move from trying to contain it in China to getting our hospital systems ready to take care of patients, scaling our diagnostic testing, public health communication to get people ready for this, making sure our public health departments were ready to do case contact tracing. But what you saw was really nothing happened for about 2 months. And it really is where we are today, why we're doing this not in person, but on a webinar, is because there was a series of failures with trying to trying to control this in the United States. And we're left in a situation that was completely predictable. If you actually look at what the characteristics of a pandemic pathogen are that I alluded to earlier and superimpose them on this SARS coronavirus, the fact is this is not surprising where we are today. And it was something preventable and predictable. And I do think it's something that's really important to remember, that this isn't something that came out of nowhere. People have been working on pandemic preparedness since at least the late 1990s, and even before that, if you take influenza pandemic preparedness. And it's something that goes through this cycle of panic and neglect, where people will be interested in pandemics and infectious disease outbreaks only when they're in the headlines. But they will fade from the headlines. And when they fade from the headlines, so does interest in preparing for them. And when you look at the cost of what it takes to prepare for a pandemic, looking at how infectious disease intersects with national security, it pales in comparison to how much it actually costs to be able to respond to these types of things after they've occurred. It's much cheaper to stop something at its source than it is when you're dealing with a pandemic. And there are systems in place that we could use and leverage to do this. We do a lot of work on tracking influenza, but there are other respiratory viruses that fit that same bill and that we should be trying to expand our surveillance of. We should be looking at coronaviruses. We should be looking at people with unexplained pneumonia, even when it's not a pandemic. How many times have you been to an urgent care center where a doctor tells you you have some virus, but doesn't tell you which virus? We have technology that will tell us what type of virus people have. And tracking those viruses, even during normal times, will help us understand what's going on in that realm of the world and help us predict what might be the next pandemic pathogen. And the fact is that these diagnostic tests have existed for years and years. They're just not used. And if they aren't used, we're going to lose them. I think that this pandemic, one of the important lessons we're going to learn is how important it is to do diagnostic testing. That's been basically the original sin of this pandemic, is our failure to diagnostically test. And I do think, and I hope that after this pandemic, that we do get better and don't leave things kind of sitting without any kind of diagnosis. So, for example, when people have pneumonia or have septic shock in the hospital, that we're really trying to diagnose individuals to the most extreme level, trying to figure out what caused their illness, the way we do with cancer. We don't tell people they just have cancer. But yeah, with infectious diseases, so often people say you just have some type of virus. And I think it's really, really important because we don't do this as well as we should. And infectious disease has really fallen behind many other parts of medicine because of that. So that kind of ends my formal presentation. And I hope that was useful, trying to talk about how to think about these pandemic pathogens and what's predictable and what's not predictable. So I'm happy to take questions in the remaining time. And I left a lot of time for questions.
Thank you so much. Well, I've got a question here, and it's about this preparedness that you talked about. And of course, I think what we learned throughout the day today is that a lot of the policies and the way policies get implemented and get passed will differ widely between country, and primarily between like the U.S. and a lot of European countries. Like healthcare policies are very different, and the outcome of this virus will be very different in terms of the policy that it drives. But from what you're seeing in your community and in the U.S., how much of these lessons and these emergency preparedness lessons do you think will end up making it in policy, just based on the way things are set up there? And what are the things that you think are most likely to make it into policy that could help us in a future pandemic?
So this happens all the time, that we do get lots of policy proposals after a pandemic has occurred. So if you look back to the anthrax attacks in the United States in 2001, that's actually a good example. During the Bush administration, there was a real effort to stand up all of these different programs and policies in order to prepare the country for infectious disease emergencies. But 2001 is 19 years ago, and people's memories have faded. And I do think that's the issue that happens with every pandemic, whether it's anthrax or Ebola or Zika, whatever it might be, or pandemic flu, things wane. And I do think right now there is this window of opportunity where we can put the right policies in place, where we can make sure that we take the right actions when the next pandemic occurs, and not be caught as flat-footed as we were with this pandemic. And there are policies to increase funding, for example, of some of our public health agencies that are key, like the CDC, like parts of HHS, the Health and Human Services, that are really key tasked with this important role of infectious disease emergencies, trying to develop broad spectrum antivirals, trying to increase and speed vaccine development, trying to improve the FDA process. All of that is all being talked about now. And I think that this is something, hopefully, this pandemic touched people in a way that most other infectious disease outbreaks didn't, for example, Ebola or Zika. And I do think that this mark that it's going to leave on society is going to be something that's going to be with us for some time, and will hopefully influence policy for the better, so that pandemic preparedness gets the attention as a national security issue that it's so long needed to have.
Okay, thank you. Jason Crawford, if you wanted to ask your question live on the mic, just raise your hand and I'll give you microphone access. We had another question here. So this person says, I'm curious if we can take advantage of global quarantines to tackle some of these other persistent pathogens. Is now a good time to renew efforts to sterilize mosquitoes, for example? I'm not really sure I understand this.
Sure. So there are we face many infectious disease threats. And I do think that this infectious disease threat that we're in the midst of is an opportunity to educate people about the solutions that we have to many infectious disease threats. So when you talk about mosquitoes, they are a major scourge. Half of all humans that have ever lived have died of malaria. There are now new technologies available to use genetically modified mosquitoes, to use all kinds of techniques. And I do think that this is an opportunity to get better and reinforce all of the tools we have to face infectious diseases in 2020 that we didn't have even in 1990. So I do think that this is a time that we really need to take infectious disease seriously, because you can see how disruptive an infectious disease outbreak can be to the world.
Okay, Jason, you have the mic.
Hello. Hey, Amish, thanks for a good talk. Can you explain a little bit more the terms airborne versus droplet, and especially this term I've heard, aerosol? I heard that aerosol is kind of like a spectrum from droplet to airborne, but I'm not sure if that's accurate. Can you just clarify that?
Sure. So this is an important question, and it's something that comes up all the time. And just to go back, when I talked about pandemic pathogens, I thought that they have to be spread either through the respiratory droplet or airborne manner. And those are two different ways of spreading. So a respiratory droplet, we'll start with that, are relatively big droplets that emanate from your body when you cough or sneeze and fall to the ground by the action of gravity in about 6 feet or so. They don't stay suspended in the air. They go to the ground. And that's what we think about with most of our transmission with coronaviruses, with influenza, with many other types of viruses. The other type of spread is airborne, and that again is coughs and sneezes. But what happens there is the particles are so fine and small that they stay suspended in the air. So if someone has measles and they leave an elevator, that air is infectious for a period of time. And that's a very different type of epidemiology. So if you look at measles, the average person with measles infects maybe 12 to 15 other people, because the air that they breathe, the air that they've exhaled, is actually infectious. And there's only a very few things that are actually airborne that we've described. Measles, tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infection. Chickenpox is another one that's airborne. Those are the ones that we really worry about airborne spread in. Now, it's important to remember that this is a continuum. It's not as discrete as it sounds. So you can find instances where influenza, for example, or coronaviruses can get aerosolized, but it doesn't really play a major role in their spread outside of what are called aerosol generating procedures. So those are procedures that happen in a hospital where somebody might be getting their airway suction, or being put on a certain type of breathing machine, or getting a drug aerosol treatment that causes aerosolization. And that is a place where you do see airborne transmission of what are usually respiratory droplet spread. And you can even, in general, you might be able to find aerosols that are generated by somebody when they're talking or singing. But what we're seeing epidemiologically, and I think this is the big test, is not necessarily what you can do in the lab or what you can measure, but what does the epidemiology show? The epidemiology shows that most of these diseases that we talk about being respiratory droplet spread, the primary means that they spread is respiratory droplet outside of aerosol generating procedures. So it really has to do with the size of the particles and whether they stay suspended in the air for a period of time. And measles, tuberculosis, chickenpox, those are the three that we really worry about. The rest are primarily droplet, although there may be some small amount of airborne transmission that occurs. It's not significantly impacting the epidemiology of these infections, or we would be in a very different place with any of these infections.
Thank you. Pat Malarkey, did you want to ask your question? If you do, just raise your hand. Go ahead, Pat.
Okay, sure. And it's actually malarkey, believe it or not.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. And my question is, you talked a lot about testing and doing tests, and we're getting a lot of conflicting information about the accuracy of tests, both while symptoms are present and after they've subsided. So my question is, how do we really know about this virus, where it's been, where it is, and where it's going?
Well, testing is a key part of this because you have to be able to test in order to know who's infected and to know when they were infected and where they spread it. So testing is a keystone basically to any kind of control response, and diagnostic testing can take various different forms. So we do PCR testing, looking for the genetic material of the virus, and that really gives you a clue whether somebody's acutely infected. And that's something that you have a window of time where it's going to be positive. If you test too early, in somewhere early in the incubation period, it may be negative because the person doesn't have enough viral load to be detected by the PCR test. Or if you test too late, they might have recovered and the virus is gone. So that's why the other part of this is antibody testing. And we have a lot of questions about what antibody testing, what that result means in terms of durability of immunity. But we do know if someone has positive antibodies and that test is a validated test that doesn't have a lot of cross reaction with other coronaviruses, because remember, this is the 7th human coronavirus that we've discovered, that you can say that person was exposed to the coronavirus. And I think you have to meld those together. The PCR testing for active infections, as well as the serological or antibody testing to know where it's going. And I think that helps you understand the epidemic curve, where we are in this outbreak, when it started, where did it start, and where it's going. Because epidemic curves kind of follow they don't follow a bell curve, but they do follow a curve. And I think knowing when you're at the peak and when you're on the way down is really important. It's going to be key because it's one of the criteria that the White House and other states are using to open some of their economies is looking at the percent positive of testing. So you have to be able to do enough testing to be able to know where you're sitting in that epidemic curve in order to predict where you're going to be in the future and what your hospital capacity needs are going to be.
Pat, did you have a follow-up question? No, you were trying to speak earlier.
Yeah, I was wondering what PCR means.
PCR means polymerase chain reaction. It's a technical term, and what it is so I'll just try to oversimplify it a little bit. So if you've got a virus or anything and you've got genetic material there, what a PCR test does is it will amplify it. It uses certain molecular tools to amplify that piece of genetic material. So a virus has a certain genetic code, and we make a PCR test that's going to look for that code. And if it sees it, it's going to amplify it big enough that the test will then say this is positive. And the more of it you have, the higher your viral load is, meaning that how much. So there's also different it can also quantify how much virus is there, saying how much genetic material is there, and that gives us this concept of viral load. And we think that people who have higher viral loads are likely to be more infectious than those people with lower viral loads. And viral load basically goes up and goes down, just like any other type of parameter. But that's what PCR is. It was a Nobel Prize winning invention on how to detect genetic material.
We've got a couple more minutes here. If there are any other questions, just write them in the Q&A box. I had another question, but it has escaped me now. Oh, right. So earlier we were talking with Robin Hanson, who's an economist, not a medical professional, but he comes to this as an economist, right? And he's been talking about this concept of variolation, which is deliberate infection, and he has this idea where you would have this hero hotel essentially, where you would put a lot of healthy low risk people in a confined space for several weeks, whatever time it takes for the virus to enter and leave the body, and infect them at low doses so that they become immune, presumably immune to the virus. I'd like to ask you, what is sort of your, is this a concept that you've heard of? Is this something that, what is your opinion on this, basically?
So it is a concept that I've heard of, and it comes from the times before there was a vaccine for smallpox, where people would deliberately expose themselves to a small amount of smallpox to develop immunity to it, so that so they would be protected if they were exposed to smallpox in the future. And I think that was an important tool, and it moved us towards vaccination. And I think it was a real key turning point in understanding the biology of infectious diseases. I'm not someone who's a major advocate of doing this for the coronavirus, although I know that there are some people that think this is reasonable. I do think that there is some merit. It's not something that I can dismiss out of hand. It's just that you have to be very careful that you don't expose, that someone does not get a severe case. And we do see some, even though severe cases usually occur in healthy people and unhealthy people that have other medical problems or are older. You can see some infections in people that are infections that become severe in people that are younger, that happen based on idiosyncrasies in their immune system that we don't quite know about. And you have to make sure that you can contain these individuals, that they're not going to leave and they're not going to spread it. I do know we do these kind of virus challenge type experiments on other coronaviruses, and even with malaria, people get infected experimentally. So it's not completely, out in left field to think about this. I just don't know operationally what that would be useful for, because we still don't quite understand all the secrets of the immunity of this. Meaning, if you do get antibodies to it, how long are you protected from it? And are you protected in a way that's called sterilizing, meaning you can't be infected again, or can you be infected again and it's just a mild illness or a clinically silent illness? And with other coronaviruses, we know that people can be experimentally infected maybe a year later. And are those people still contagious? So I don't think that we have the answers the way we did with variolation and smallpox, where we know how this worked, because I think that it's unclear what the immunity duration and durability is. And there are individuals who've been infected with this coronavirus in the wild, meaning in a real setting where they're in the hospital, and they don't develop antibodies. So I think there's a lot of ifs that you have to do to go through before you can say that variolation is an answer to this.
And something else which was discussed in an earlier talk today that I'd like to get your thoughts on is, what's your take on the WHO posting on their website, I think this morning actually, and it might even still be there, that there is actually no evidence that exposure to the coronavirus produces immunity, or any meaningful immunity. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm sure you're aware of the statement that they've made.
Sure. The WHO put that statement out, and they since clarified it on Sunday. Actually, they clarified it, because there's a difference in the way we as physicians or scientists talk about evidence and the way that the general public takes that to mean. The fact is that there isn't evidence, because we haven't followed those people out far enough to see if they're re-exposed, do they get infected? So yes, there is not any peer-reviewed scientific evidence that shows that. But we do know that when people get infected with an infectious disease, that they do have immunity that will persist for some period of time. We don't know what the period of time is with this virus, and we don't know how durable it is and how much it wanes over time. And I think that's what the WHO statement was referencing, is the fact that we haven't done the studies to look at the duration. It doesn't mean that we have evidence to the contrary. It just means no one has done those studies yet. And I think that's kind of a term of art, the way that physicians and scientists use the word evidence versus the way people interpreted it to mean. And that's why the WHO put out a clarification soon after that first statement.
Chris has got a question. Chris, do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to do it for you? All right, well, I'll go ahead and ask it then. So what are your thoughts on citizen scientists and the DIY bio community, and what opportunities do you think exist in citizen science during this pandemic?
Well, I'm a big fan of citizen scientists, and I do like the whole DIY biology community, so long as they do it safe and nothing, and they observe the proper biosafety that you would expect them to do. I think there's lots of things that people, I think, well, so it's really hard to work with this virus. It's a BSL-3 virus. So I think you have to be really careful if you're doing DIY with this. But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that people can do in terms of looking at the genetic sequence, that they can do it on their computers at home and try and understand where this virus is going, where it came from, what strains are related to other strains. There's important research like that. I think I'd just be wary about citizen scientists working with the BSL-3 agent. Even if they have one of their friends or somebody that gets infected, you want to make sure that you're doing biosafety. So I don't want to encourage people to experiment with this virus outside of a proper laboratory, because we don't want inadvertent infections to occur. And you want to make sure that people are handling this virus safely. And I don't think most DIY bio enthusiasts have access to that type of biosafety.
Okay, I'm conscious of your time here, but I've got a couple more questions here. Naveed, go ahead. You're on the mic.
Hi, thanks. Real quick question. The Imperial College numbers early on were really high. You probably remember like the 5.6%, up to 5.6%, and that drove a lot of the media and everything, which is interesting itself. But anyway, recently the antibody testing from Stanford shows, I'm sure you know the numbers and the impact of the difference between case and infectious fatality, considering the community spread. So just wondered what the discussion is among the scientists in your space about that kind of, how that response, what happened there, and just generally get your thoughts on that.
Sure. So in the early days of any type of outbreak, you're going to get what's called a severity bias in the data, because the cases that come to light, the ones that show up in hospitals, aren't going to be representative of what's going on in the community, because there's many people, especially with a virus like this, for the majority of people who just get common cold-like symptoms, aren't going to be counted. They're not going to be at the hospital. They're not going to get a test. So we knew from the very beginning, when you were seeing numbers like 5.6%, that was really a reflection of severity bias. And once we tested more, once testing was including everybody, those with mild symptoms, those that were exposed, that you would see this case fatality rate fall. And you have seen it fall. And many studies now have really started to look at this being less than 1%. And some studies have it even lower than that, like at 0.5%, and even some even lower than that. So I do think that this is something that we knew was going to happen. And if you remember back to 2009 in the H1N1 pandemic, when we started getting reports in Mexico of individuals dying and on ventilators in Mexico with a novel flu virus, everybody was very, very worried. But we quickly figured out that that was a severity bias sample. This is a little bit different, because even though the case fatality rate may be 0.5 or in that range, the fact is there's no population immunity to this like there was for H1N1 in 2009. So the fact is a small percentage of a big number of susceptible individuals is still going to lead to a big number. So this will have an outsized impact when you compare it to seasonal flu or even to the pandemic in 2009, H1N1. And the other pandemics in 57 and 68, because of the fact that there is no population level immunity. But we did know that those numbers were influencing modelers, influencing people to think about social distancing measures. And that's unfortunate that sometimes those models and those numbers can be misinterpreted, because many policymakers are trying to err on the side of caution. And sometimes they're heavily influenced by spurious numbers and severity bias. And I think that's clearly what we saw in the early stages of this outbreak, although many of us in the field had thought that this was likely to be less than 1%.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughtful commentary and your talk on this very important topic. I think we all learned something here from how this virus spreads, and looking forward to following you on Twitter and all of the interesting things that you're putting out. So where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is at Amesh, AMESHAA. I also have a website called Tracking Zebra, which is a blog and stuff that you could find stuff that I've written there. I haven't updated it for a little bit, but that's a good way to find me if you need to get in contact with me, or on Twitter.
Thank you. And have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you for having me.